Dr. Benjamin Tallis is a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. He runs the project Action Group Zeitenwende on the transformation of Germany's security and foreign policy, and he also hosts the podcast Berlin Inside Out. He previously worked for the EU on security missions in Ukraine and the Balkans, and was policy officer at the European Centre of Excellence for Civilian Crisis Management in Berlin. Benjamin spent 5 years at the Institute of International Relations, Prague, where he headed the Centre for European Security and advised numerous European governments, and edited the journal New Perspectives. As many of you will know, he regularly appears in the media and has also been published in Foreign Policy, Politico, The Independent, and many leading academic journals. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like, subscribe, definitely add a comment. It really does help people to discover our incredible speakers on the channel. Please also check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. And after you've done that, consider buying me a coffee or becoming a patron of the channel. We will be making a lot of exclusive material available via that. Not interview format. We're going to be transcribing some of the best Russian language journalism from Ukraine and from exiled Russian journalists as well, to provide you a much more detailed perspective about what's going on. But Benjamin, welcome back to the channel. This is the second time that I've been privileged to welcome you.
It's great to be back with you, Jonathan. Thanks very much for having me on.
Well, one of the things we were talking about in preparation for this conversation is really the topic of leadership, and that's cut through the whole of this war over the last couple of years. And a lot of the criticism, when perhaps we felt that the right decisions weren't being made or weren't being made fast enough to aid a Ukrainian victory, a lot of it came back to leadership. And you've written very compellingly on this in the context of Europe, and indeed the elections coming up and the appointments of the next European Commission. Could you give us an overview of what you think the key issues are?
Sure. I mean, it's often said that Europe has a leadership deficit, and in places that's true. But actually, we also have some really good leaders in Europe, and we've seen them rise to the fore during the full-scale war. And thinking of people like Kallas, the Estonian Prime Minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, the Lithuanian Foreign Minister, Jan Lipavsky in the Czech Republic, and also Ursula von der Leyen, who seemed like a leader reborn, actually, in the crucible of the scrutiny that she faced after the Russian full-scale invasion, and the way that she actually transformed EU policy on Ukraine, upturning 2 decades of EU policy in 2 sentences, which I've been working on that EU policy for most of that time, and it was a remarkable thing. So we do actually see there are leaders in Europe, but of course there are strategic deficits as well as leadership deficits elsewhere, and I'm looking in Berlin in particular, but there have been also more widespread lack of backup for those who have been able to lead the way. So the smaller European states that really got their strategic act together, led the way on Ukraine, and have also been leading the way in NATO. It's not just me saying that, that's even what Antony Blinken recently said about the Baltic states. They've not been backed up, and they've not been able to link up what they're doing fully with the sort of mighty economies of Europe, which would make all the difference in terms of sustaining our support for Ukraine, but also sustaining our own rearmament, which is going to be extremely necessary in the coming years as we seek to deter and potentially to defeat Russia. So we have this imbalanced situation, and where it's coming to the fore right now is in the competition for jobs in the new European Commission. And we've seen the news that Kallas has been nominated by 3 of the main European parties in the parliament to be the new High Representative for foreign and security policy, which is excellent news if it's confirmed on Thursday or Friday, which we hope it will be. But she's going to need support in that European Commission. And so people like Landsbergis, it's essential to have them there as well, because frankly, Europe needs its best players on the pitch right now.
And this is extraordinary, isn't it? That, as you say, these are politicians from the small countries, those who are closest to Russia. And it's not just the last couple of years, it's the last couple of decades. They've been telling us about, that we need to be wary of Russia, that we need to look beyond, the sort of propaganda and the superficial details. Is it true to say that they've largely been ignored over decades? So their rise to the potentially highest offices in Europe is an extraordinary transformation.
Yes, it really is. Not just ignored, but patronized and belittled over the last 20 years. Absolutely. Accused of Russophobia, of hysteria, of small state perspectives, which are irrelevant to the wider great game of geopolitics. But guess what? It turned out they were absolutely right. And it turned out they were right in a number of ways. One was about the Russian threat. Second has been about the need to back Ukraine to the hilt and for Ukraine to win. The third has been about the validity of the enlargement of NATO, a voluntary sphere of integration, which has kept those countries safe. And so they've really provided a very powerful, practical response to anyone who thought that NATO enlargement was a bad idea. But also they've been right on the importance of values in international politics and on the importance of democratic ordering. Now, that may come more naturally to smaller states because, as Kallas famously said, small states don't get to make mistakes in geopolitics. You make a mistake, you could get wiped out. So they rely on having that protective shield of allies and protective shield of an order that actually structures relations between states in a way that keeps them safe. But actually, you can apply that to the larger states of Europe as well. We're dependent on each other fundamentally for our security, and we're also dependent on the US for our security through NATO. But we're also dependent on each other for our betterment and for our prosperity. And that's something we really need to get back to understanding there, is that we need to be playing as a team. And that's when democracies have been at their best. And actually, when in that historical anomaly of democracy's dominance, we did play as a team and we were at our best individually as well. And we need to get back that winning mentality, because at the moment, too many of our politicians are still thinking like also-rans.
And it's interesting you use that word enlargement as opposed to expansion, because the Russian narrative, the tone and detail of it still unfortunately percolates sections of the media, political dialogue. And whether it's on the extreme left or right, there are many people who are essentially pointing fingers either directly or in the way they structure their language towards EU and NATO, and essentially suggesting they bear culpability for Russia's full-scale war.
Yes, I did notice it's penetrated Nigel Farage's discourse and thankfully busted down Reform UK's poll ratings by about 3 points after he made that gaffe on the British radio, I think it was. So yes, people are still spouting this propaganda because it seems on one level to make some kind of logical sense, but it only makes logical sense if you accept that dictatorships have valid security concerns. And secondly, if you believe in empire and the spheres of influence of great powers. And you're right, I deliberately used the word enlargement rather than expansion, which is often talked about. Now, again, Kallas talks very well, and she talked on our podcast about this recently. This was not something that was imposed on those countries. They had to fight for it. They really had to fight tooth and nail to be accepted. And the first three countries from Central Eastern Europe, the Czech Republic, Poland and Hungary, who joined the alliance, NATO, that is in 1999, they had to fight to get in. 2004, the Baltic states and others who are now among the frontline states, including Romania, they had to fight really hard to be accepted. And there's lots of great literature on this, showing the resistance that there was in many Western European countries to doing this, to offering full partnership, equal terms to countries that they often still look down on, who had just come out of 40 years of Soviet occupation or of dictatorship, authoritarian regimes of communist variety. And in order to actually be fully accepted, sort of to return to Europe, as Václav Havel, the Czech leader, put it, or return to the West, they really had to pull out every trick in the book. That was moral, it was economic, it was institutional, and they went through this process in the 90s. And this has been the most successful thing that the EU has ever done. The EU's enlargement in 2004 with 8 Central East European states, then followed up with 2 more 2 years later. That's widely recognized as the EU's greatest foreign policy success, because it domesticated foreign policy in the way that the EU has been able to do better than practically any other organization. But also NATO enlargement, we now see the real value of that. NATO countries don't get attacked. Non-NATO countries do. So if you're still buying this argument that NATO expansion, as they call it, provoked Vladimir Putin into doing what he's doing, then you're siding with an imperial and chauvinist view of the world, whereby might makes right, and the strong do what they will and the weak accept what they must. And that's not a world that any of us who believe in democracy should want to live in.
It is, however, a point of view that it's not just confined to Farage and others. There is, and you've spoken very strongly out against this, a school of geopolitical realists often who will advocate neutrality in the face of evil. They will say that morality plays no part in foreign policy. You're suggesting here that the reality of the extension of rule of law and all the benefits of NATO and the EU to states of the former Soviet Union, that actually that's a moral as well as a political process and a correct one. So how do we see the geopolitical realists and the justifications they use? How can they ignore the power and impact of that reality that you've just described?
Well, realism is a disposition. Realism, in that sense, of international academic international relations, is a discipline. It's almost a sort of competition to see who can take the most absurd point of view and try and give it a logical, intellectual gloss. It's a certain question of the stomach that they're willing to supposedly bear the uncomfortable truths that liberal softies like myself and others couldn't bear to think about human beings and the world. But what it actually has been throughout its history, and that there are very good histories of this have been written, is an excuse for imperialism, an excuse for chauvinism, and actually, frankly, some of the moments where our policy's been inspired by that have been our worst moments in our policy. It's telling that one of the fathers of intellectual realism and academic realism, E.H. Carr, advocated appeasing Adolf Hitler. He was a big fan of the Soviet Union. So again, think about what kind of world you wish for. Those were appeased in his view. I mean, he had a certain political sympathy for the Soviet Union and for communism, in fact. From the Nazis, it was basically about appeasing a great power and allowing great powers to do what they will and to thus walk over Czechoslovakia, which is where I'm now actually sitting in the territory of the former Czechoslovakia, now Czech Republic. And that's not, again, a world I think that we should be aiming for. I'd highly recommend anyone who wants a good history of realism to read Matthew Spector's book, The Atlantic Realists, which gives you chapter and verse on how this has been tied up from the very beginning in that kind of chauvinistic imperialist thinking.
And another interesting aspect, and this is one where you may or may not agree, it seems that the intent of Russian propaganda aligns with the impact of geopolitical realist thinking. And Russian propaganda isn't necessarily designed to convince you of something, it's designed to make the world seem complex, impossible, convince you that really you have no agency, no ability to change it. So why try? Even though it's wrapped up in different clothes and tone, it would seem the impact of the geopolitical realist school is also succumb to evil, maintain neutrality, don't take action, don't have any morality, because it will only bring you nothing. It'll bring you nothing good.
That's such an interesting connection that you draw, and I think it's one that bears further investigation, actually, because I agree with you on what the aim of Russian propaganda is: to destabilize, to paralyze, to demotivate and demoralize, to overcomplicate things, to make you throw up your hands and give up in despair at the complexity and difficulty of it all. But of course, indeed, that does actually share a something, at least, or a familial resemblance with some forms of academic realism, who would say that you cannot better human nature, you cannot improve things, you succumb to a tragic view of the world, which therefore says you must accept things, quote unquote, as they are. Now, of course, any theory that is telling you to accept a certain version of human nature is imposing a vision on you as much as it's claiming to describe. And this is, of course, one of the tricks that realism has pulled, which is to claim to be a neutral observer of the actual reality that we have to face, whereas actually it's creating and constructing a reality of how the world should be, and therefore working towards that. So I think there is definitely a familial resemblance there, and overcoming both of these things, it's essential to have some notion of progress that you can actually achieve. And that's, of course, why I talk about neo-idealism and the return of the hope of progress being crucial to us sustaining there's not only the survival of liberal societies, but to how we thrive in future.
And something I've heard that's interesting from many Ukrainians through this is the idea that neutrality in the face of evil is something that actually enables it to grow and enables it to propagate. That's another one of the interesting sort of delusions of our time, isn't it? That peace at any price is something that's worth pursuing. It is also almost fantastical belief that a vacuum can exist in geopolitics. That you can have, contested ground that remains, undominated, as it were. And we see this to an extent playing out across the African continent, where US, France, and other European interests have withdrawn or almost given up the fight And we see Iran, Russia, China really piling in and taking advantage. So again, what's this idea? How would you tackle this morality in geopolitics and use it to counter the idea that there is no such thing as a vacuum, no such thing as uncontested ground? If you don't fill it, malign influence will find a way to fill that gap.
Yeah, again, I think it's a great point. And I mean, it's not just neutrality in the face of evil, but cowardice and cynicism and hoping that you will, by sacrificing others, you will save yourself, which is just about the lowest form of human behavior. And if you multiply that up to the geopolitical level, you can quite easily see how you'll end up in a lot of trouble. I mean, that famous quote attributed to Churchill, I don't know actually if it's apocryphal or not, where he says, "An appeaser is the one who hopes the crocodile is going to eat him last." And this I think is true today, and it's interesting to see the clear communication on this that we've had from people like Landsbergis and Kallas. And Gabrielis Landsbergis said, we should call the peace camp the surrender camp, because that's actually what they're advocating for. And both he and Kallas have also been extremely clear. They say, everyone actually wants peace, but it's how you get to it and what is actually a sustainable peace, a just peace, a peace that brings you security and the possibility to thrive in the long term, not just a cessation of violence, which, as we know, would give Putin the chance to rearm, which would create a real geopolitical gray zone right in the heart of Europe, which would, as it was, I think, Jonathan Vseviov who said recently, would only bring us war and chaos. So I think it's extremely important to reclaim some of these words from those who claim to represent the peace camp, which is actually often, as we say, the cynical surrender camp and the cowardly camp. So we have to actually be aiming for a peace that gives us security and gives Ukraine security and a secure Europe and a stable Europe. Now, that's a lot of work, and we've got a lot to do on that, because we have to arm ourselves to the teeth, and we have to arm Ukraine to win at the same time. We have to get our geoeconomic house in order as well, because we are undermined, we are threatened from all sides because of our dependencies on authoritarians, not just for fossil fuels, but also for critical minerals, processed minerals, components for our green transition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, particularly on China. And then when you also say, but there's so many hotspots around the world we have to deal with, yes, there are. And indeed, these vacuums will be filled. But the essence of strategy is being able to prioritize. And prioritization is not about getting rid of unimportant things. Prioritization is about getting rid of important things that are not the most important. And so actually in the work of strategy in Europe at the moment, which is what also I think Kallas and Landsbergis are very good at, much better than, for example, the German government with the national security strategy, where everything is a priority and consequently nothing is, and it gives you no guidance. They're able to zero in on what are the biggest threats that we face and how do we deal with those and how do we build out from that. And actually, that's also what neo-idealism is effectively about building the solid core that we need in order to give our democracies the chance to thrive and thus provide the attractive example, which would give us the transformative power to approach those other places and say, look, don't you want to live more like us? And honestly, we have a better offer than any of the authoritarian states if we live up to our promises. So I think we have to be realistic about how much we can do at once, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to actually influence those situations as long as we get our core right first.
It's extraordinary, isn't it, how the threat of annihilation really focuses the mind. And the Baltics have lived through it. I mean, one of the interesting details you shared is Kai Kallas, her family actually were in the Gulag, and not all of them made it out. So you've got this direct lived experience of, I would say, genocidal autocracy.
Yes, and I mean, this is something that's very palpable when you go to the Baltics, and I've been traveling up there a lot, especially in the last 2 years. And I was lucky enough to be in Vilnius in January, at the time when they were remembering the January protests and the events during which 14 protesters were killed by Soviet tanks back in 1991. And this is why Gorbachev does not have a good reputation in the Baltics, even if he's loved in Germany and elsewhere. When people came out on the street to defend their core democratic institutions of what was then the nascent independence movement, which was headed by Gabrielis Landsbergis' grandfather, Vytautas Landsbergis, who became the symbol of these protests. But the signs and the messages you see up there, we'd rather die on our feet than live on our knees. And those people knew what living on their knees meant. And so rising up and putting themselves in harm's way was the right thing to do as they saw it and was the better alternative. Now, that's being realistic, not realist in the other sense. So I think you do see that, but it's important also to emphasize that none of Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, other frontline states, they get what's at stake. They understand the scale of the threat and the scale of the problem they face, but they're not afraid. They're not governed by fear. They're able to overcome that fear and use it to be on alert and to actually act in a decisive and meaningful way. They're not paralyzed by fear, same way as they're not paralyzed by indecision. So I think there's a real lesson there for the rest of Europe to say, look, you can be aware of what is a monumental threat, but you don't have to succumb to it and actually make it a self-fulfilling prophecy that you will collapse in advance. You have to rise to that moment. And that's, and again, why we need those kind of leaders calling the shots for us.
Are they also more acutely aware of how money and influence can actually undermine national security? One of the big arguments, one of the big conversations we had last time was about how Russian influence, Russian money, and indeed the desire of the German elite, thinking that through trade you could civilize Russia and prevent, any of the sort of aggression we're seeing now. That, of course, has failed catastrophically. The Baltics have been advising for many decades not to put national security at risk through this kind of economic dependence on Russia.
Yes, I mean, of course, we have to recognize that the Baltic states also did business with Russia, but they did it more carefully. And already 10 years ago, we're starting to see the Lithuanians try and get off Russian gas very quickly and set up the LNG terminal named Independence that actually gives them their economic and energy independence. So they've been ahead of the curve on that, but it's not like they didn't have lessons to actually learn on it too. It's just they learned them earlier, quicker, and we should have been learning from them. We should have been listening to them. Now, of course, as we said last time in the German case, change through trade is hard, especially if you don't try for the change part. And that's precisely what happened with their relation to Russia. So yes, I think there is a key learning on that. And where I would really point to, again, the leadership that's been shown would be Lithuania's example on Taiwan. So they opened a representative office in the name of Taiwan, not in the name of Taipei. And it's only one Chinese character different, but it makes all the difference in the world to the Taiwanese who are able to, that's the only representative office they have in Europe in their own name. And of course, Lithuania has a history of this being recognized by others. It was Iceland who were the first to recognize Lithuania. So a small state, but one that made a very, very important gesture, which then opened the way for others to also recognize Lithuania. And so by doing this, the Lithuanian government, and this was pioneered by Landsbergis and a group in the Lithuanian Foreign Ministry, they invited the Taiwanese to open the representative office. And this, of course, caused outrage in Beijing, who threatened all sorts of economic consequences, threatened that any companies in Europe using Lithuanian components in their supply chains would be barred from doing business in China or be subject to sanctions. Now, interestingly, in this case, the German companies actually stood with Lithuania. So there's one component in Volkswagen's arsenal of components that is made in Lithuania, which was the device for raising and lowering the windows in the cars. And what they decided was that this was actually offering a service rather than a part as such. So they bought the service of the window opening, rebranded it as that, and were able to continue going about this. But it was interesting that Lithuania got backing on that. And the Lithuanian government helped their businesses get through this. Again, pioneered by Landsbergis, but also by Prime Minister Ingrida Šimonytė. They loaned businesses about 130 million euros. They got loan guarantees further and investment guarantees of 600 million euros from the US, and also got a large investment from Taiwan, more than 200 million in actual investments and nearly $1 billion in terms of loan guarantees and investments. And they have thrived on this base. They have prospered and they faced down the Chinese threat. So it's about understanding you can stand up to bullies, basically, and that you can do well by doing good. And again, that's that synthesis that's at the heart of the neo-idealist approach that I think they more than anyone embody.
And this suggests that actually there's strength in common values, because if it's just one small country that gets picked off and everybody sacrifices them for their own economic interest, you can see a scenario where this isn't going to work too well. But if it's a common set of values which everyone stands up for, or the majority do, then it sounds like it has a good chance of overcoming autocratic objections.
It does, and that's where unity can actually be our strength. There's a lot of talk about unity in NATO and in the EU, but unfortunately, too often it's lowest common denominator unity around Berlin rather than Tallinn, and that's not going to help anyone because it really puts us at the lowest end of our game. But when we're united at the highest common factor, which was in that case with Lithuania and China, then yes, that's incredibly strong. And that's actually what those organizations are partly there for. The big function of NATO during the Cold War was high-level peer pressure, collective spine stiffening in the face of what was primarily a political and psychological threat. George Kennan famously talked about the towers of the Kremlin casting long shadows, and it's those shadows rather than the substance of things that move the hearts and minds of statesmen. And that's what NATO was there to do. It was there to shine light across those shadows and make sure that we're not spooked by them. And it gave a forum during that time when we were perhaps, I think, individually as well as collectively a bit more politically courageous to tell others, no, that's not a good move in all of our interests. No, you're not going to do that because that's going to undermine us. No, this is how we stand up together. And that collectivity of it, from smaller states as well as large, made sure that we weren't picked off one by one. And this was the mission at the beginning of NATO. What really triggered, or what, let's say, accelerated that process of forming NATO was the coup in Czechoslovakia in 1948 and the threat that Norway might be next. And that this was succumbing, one ally after another would be succumbing to political pressure. And so in order to prevent that happening, that's why a real treaty was needed. And then the organization, the O in NATO, came afterwards. But it was that treaty that really helped keep us together. And again, I think we need to recover that political purpose. And it's through the kind of leadership towards highest common factor rather than lowest common denominator unity that we can regain that strength. So that's, again, why we need people like Kallas and Landsbergis.
Does this extend to security and even military capabilities as well? Because it's all very well for individual states to head off and build this and buy that and do this. But again, you can foresee a scenario there where that doesn't then gel together in a moment of crisis. And in fact, is it not true that the last 2 years have shown that really we are still incredibly slow moving and not necessarily coordinated in terms of how we respond to an extraordinary existential threat?
Yes, overall, when you say we collectively, agreed. There are exceptions. Poland moving at pace and scale to rearm, 4.34% of GDP spent on weapons, the vast majority of it, or spent on defense rather, the vast majority of it on major new weapon systems. Other countries, the Baltic states, also way above 2% of GDP, buying large quantities of HIMARS, buying other key core kit that they need. The Czechs with their F-35 deal. There's a lot of big capabilities being brought in, but there's a danger that it's not backed up. So Germany's still moving slow. Yeah, they also bought F-35s. Yes, they're buying some other things, but it's not coming online soon. And other capabilities are not being bought in the quantity that they need to be. French rearmament is not happening at major pace and scale. The UK is also not doing that. But where the big issue of this comes is that all of the NATO states need to round out their capability profile. So you need the boring stuff as well as the flashy stuff. So you need people to maintain your F-35s. You need people to crew and repair and provide the fuel for your CV-90s, like the Czechs have bought, I think, 246 of those. But they need all of that to go with it and enough troops as well, well-trained troops. And so we're not there yet in terms of rounding that out. The other big part of this in Europe, and if we're getting serious about talking about a European pillar of NATO, which I think we really should be, especially with like the Washington summit coming up, that's what's going to be needed as an offer from the Europeans. We need what are called enablers, strategic enablers that help us to actually do the targeting, for example, for our weapons to network missions together to do command and control. Things like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, be that air, sea, and ground-based surveillance from particular platforms, or be it actually human intelligence work or signals intelligence, and then also satellite imaging and so on and so forth. All of that, at the moment, Europe is incredibly reliant on the United States for. Now, those are the kind of footloose capabilities that if Washington had to choose between Europe and the Indo-Pacific, those would be gone and they'd be over in the Indo-Pacific. And even if we're investing in things that seem to improve our combat power, without those enablers, we won't be able to use it. And the other big thing where we lack is strategic strike capability. So at the moment, the devastating, catastrophic response that would be promised to any Russian tactical nuclear use comes from the US JASSMs, basically the long-range stealthy cruise missiles that provide massed precision strike capability. Europe simply doesn't have that many precision long-range strike weapons. And so we really need to build that up together. And this is where there's a role for the EU in terms of the new Defence Industry Commissioner, who's hopefully going to be appointed as part of the new commission, to coordinate common procurement with common funding. And we're going to have to get over the German objection on that, because they're exporting their own sins to others, or trying to generalize their own mistake, I think, unfortunately. But EU funding, EU coordination, which would then really serve the building of a European pillar of NATO, is exactly what we need right now.
And it seems as well that there are some critical bits which this common defense is going to have to perhaps be a little more flexible than it has been. So there are two things, I think, which the Ukrainian war has shown that really weren't that much part of our strategic thinking. One was traditional weapons like traditional artillery shells, but in quantities, not seen since the First World War. Obviously, we're not geared up to sort of build and deploy at that kind of scale, plus, as you say, the trained crews. So that's reviving old world technology. At the same time, you've got the extraordinary development of drone and electronic warfare, which is moving at an incredible pace. And in that instance, you've got the unit cost being driven down by an extraordinary feedback loop between the innovators, the manufacturers, and those on the front line, which in a traditional sort of European NATO procurement cycle could take years, whereas Ukraine is moving those cycles of innovation to weeks. We're not really geared up either for the scale or for the agility which it would seem modern warfare requires. And it also suggests that if you don't have Britain and Ukraine as part of that common European sort of security pillar, it's not going to work.
No, dead right. I fully agree with the last point. We certainly, if we're going to get serious about European security, then it means both UK and Ukraine in a meaningful way, and that's why we have to be looking at what's the architecture that we're going to build if Ukraine doesn't get an invitation to NATO, which is looking increasingly likely anytime soon. So how do we actually go beyond the defense pacts that are there at the moment, which do not include mutual defense clauses, to something that's much more substantial and would supply Ukraine with a meaningful prospect of a viable future. And that would, of course, allow Ukrainians to return. We need the UK involved as well. Still one of Europe's two nuclear powers. Massive capabilities actually on the enablers side, as well as on the naval side, the air side, et cetera, et cetera. But in general, I fully agree with your wider point there. We're not geared in terms of our thinking and our industrial organization to the new ways this is being done. There are some people trying to change that, but until we get our capital market structure right, there's not going to be enough of people doing that. And we're going to be at state level picking winners, which is not good industrial policy at all. So we need to get our capital markets right, and we need to incentivize people to invest in defense. We need to be getting our capital market structure right for other things as well, like the green transition, which currently we're paying for rather than profiting from. So there's a raft of measures we could take there, but also other incentives and ways of organizing things that the Defense Industry Commissioner could help with. Because I think you're right. Basically, the Spitfire of today is a drone, probably, because what we've seen over the last 30 years is the growth of these so-called exquisite platforms, incredibly costly individual planes, for example, which are now too costly to be risked anywhere near the front line. And that's absolutely useless. So we have to have stuff that's expendable, that can be attrited through combat. And my feeling is that is going in the way of uncrewed systems. And Jack Watling's book on this is very good. Another recommendation for reading there. But we don't know necessarily what's coming next. And we don't know how the advances in lethality that have been provided by drones, or the advances in ability to conduct warfare that have been provided by those. We don't know how long that's going to last. I mean, there might be something that is also innovated within the next couple of years that takes the edge off that. So we don't need, again, to be picking winners on that. We need to be creating an ecosystem which can actually deliver and respond quickly to evolving battlefield developments and to our strategic needs. And again, that's where I would see a really strong role for the EU working in coordination with European NATO countries. to put the money in, first of all, to create the structures of investment, and to create other incentives for innovation.
And it sounds like Britain, which, despite Brexit, still has some of the, largest markets for innovation, tech innovation. The Ukrainian example suggests that you cannot do without that sort of common alliance between tech entrepreneurialism, their ability to break stuff, move fast, as you say, create an ecosystem where some will stand, some will fall, but you need to be testing ideas continuously.
Oh, absolutely right. And there's a mentality to that which requires a bit of a shift on continental Europe as well, to more risk taking. And this appetite or lack of appetite for risk is again seen in the capital markets sector, where you see so many mom and pop shop investment funds sitting on small pots of money with very conservative investors who are not looking for massive returns. And consequently, you don't get the unified big pots of cash that could actually go in to drive real innovation there. So I think we really have to look at that in a holistic way. And we also have to look at, again, what our dependencies are. We have to actually take economic security seriously into account for this, as well as cyber resilience. So we have to be growing our capabilities, and we have to be doing more with our friends. Friendshoring is a great idea, especially in defense industry. So there will be costs to doing that. At the same time, what we have to be clear about is they're worth paying, because the payoff for them is much better than actually continuing to rely on tech from abroad or just bought in systems. So we have a lot of work to do to get that right from the beginning of the chain to the end.
Well, the last question here, because you're in Prague, I'm sure you're desperate to go out and have a beer and get some food, because I know you've been traveling during the day. The last question, a bit of a double-barreled one here, and this is very much about the very concept of NATO, which is to keep the Americans in, keep the Russians out. But you've also made the point that as part of this values-based foreign policy, you really need to create a grand strategy. Now, doesn't that grand strategy need to be based on the idea of common values? And at the moment, it seems the US has a very divided, not just political system, but both internally and Russia's been able to pour petrol on the flames of this, an extraordinary sort of divisive set of issues that are dividing people socially. How challenging is it going to be to build a grand strategy based on common values, which would seem to be the necessity to hold this together and hold our ground against the autocrats?
Well, it's interesting. If you look at the history of NATO, there has been a certain element of, let's politely call it pragmatism, at its heart, taking in countries such as Portugal, which was strategically extremely important, not only for its own location, but also for its Azores Islands in the middle of the Atlantic, which were a very useful staging point for US assets coming across the Atlantic. And more recently, we've seen the indulgence of Turkey within the alliance, again, because of its geostrategic significance, rather than any great commitment to democratic or liberal values from the Erdogan regime. So I think that there is a role for pragmatism when the goal is improvement over time on values. If you're just retreating into cynical pragmatism, then there shouldn't be. But also NATO's attitude to this has endured across different crises that the alliance has had and different schisms. And what I find interesting in the US at the moment is that there is a big divide on a lot of questions. But one thing that doesn't divide Americans is freedom. And across both political parties, across almost all demographics of voters, if you can say this is about freedom, people will support you. And fundamentally, NATO is about freedom, and it has to recover that as its core messaging. And my friend Andrew Michter often makes the point. He says, if I go to a farmer in Iowa and say this is for the liberal international order, he's going to say, in my best Andrew impersonation, what are you smoking? But if you actually say this is for freedom, this is so people can live in freedom. You want to be left alone. They want to be left alone to do their thing, to prosper in the way that they see fit, and to have a reasonable chance of doing so. And I think this is what we also have to get to a little bit more in our domestic politics, is understanding what it is that unites us, rather than taking every opportunity to see the division that is actually there. There are some fundamentals that we are united around, and we haven't been very good at living up to our promises on a number of those things in recent years. So this does very much begin at home, and that's also something NATO's known throughout its history. I was just reading something the other day. It's a very interesting example from, I think, 1973, when Kissinger and Nixon launched their ill-fated Year of Europe in NATO, which, as European politicians at the time commented, nobody asked for that. But when addressing the NATO, the North Atlantic Council, Nixon actually made a point of saying, we need social housing, we need kindergartens, we need X, Y, and Z in terms of social policy, which isn't necessarily what you'd expect from a Kissinger influenced president to be talking about that. But why did he say that? Because it's a war on two fronts. Because he understood that actually the Soviets were trying to undermine us at home. And the competitive offer, if you like, from communism of provision for society at whatever level, and we know much more about the state of that now than they did back then. But nonetheless, the idea was we have to give a good offer to our people. And so I think that's essential to recover that part of this about living up to our values at home, as well as delivering and defending freedom abroad. And if we can do that, then NATO has a chance for a future. But just one last thing to emphasize is that if NATO is going to have a future, then the Europeans need to step up, regardless of who becomes president, regardless of which sort of leaning in terms of values the American people choose. It doesn't matter. We need to step up and do more for our security. And that means investing in the way that I outlined before. It means building a real, credible, capable, and connected European pillar of NATO. And that's where we need to be working with each other a bit better. But we also need leadership. And again, this is where I cannot emphasize enough. The caliber of leaders is essential. We've seen Kaja Kallas was snubbed for the NATO job. Thankfully, she's going to get a chance to shine, we think, in the high representative position, and there should be others like Landsbergis there too. But NATO also needs to show that it was recognized the leadership that's been shown in Central Eastern Europe. So in a Deputy Secretary General position or Assistant Secretary General positions, and in trusting Central Eastern Europeans to lead on key things, key issues, key portfolios, and perhaps in welcoming Poland into the nuclear sharing club. There's a lot that NATO could do to indicate that actually it's rebalancing in a way that would make it more credible.
And it sounds like that combination of strategic purpose with will is going to help a lot. And the things you've outlined, the work that you're doing, hopefully will get us much closer to that sort of deterrent policy that genuinely prevents Russia and its malign ambitions, which it clearly is still expressing, not just towards Ukraine, but to many other territories as well. Ben, thanks so much for coming on the channel. It's always a massive pleasure. I hope to see you at some events in the real world later this year and next year. But for now, thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure to be on again. Great to see you, John. Take care.